right, so now we're going to jump into the autonomic nervous system. So that's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic part of the entire nervous system organization. So let's just really quick go through that organization. So we have the nervous system, and that includes everything, all the neurons, all that communication that takes place to give you sensory, motor, and control all of your organs. So that's everything together. Then that is divided into the central nervous system, which is pretty simple. It's just the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so if it's in the brain and the spinal cord, it's considered the central nervous system. We talk about things as being central acting medications. That just means that it acts in the central nervous system. The blood-brain barrier protects the central nervous system, or I don't know, protects is I guess the idea, but it limits what can move. Things are limited as to what can move in and out of the central nervous system. Then you have the peripheral nervous system, and that's everything outside the brain and spinal cord, and that includes two divisions: motor, okay, so motor neurons or motor functions, and sensory, so out efferent and in afferent. Okay, so out is the motor neurons, and it also includes glands, so CNS to the muscles. And then sensory is anything, sensory organs, any kind of sensation that is going into the central nervous system. Okay, so if we look at this motor side of things, it also has two branches or divisions, and that is the somatic nervous system, which is controlling voluntary movement. So that's you moving your arm, picking up your coffee, sitting down, running, whatever. Things that you can muscle control muscles that you have control over. And then there's the autonomic, and that is involuntary response. So that's something, it's still efferent, it's still information going out from the central nervous system, except you don't really control it. So that's the involuntary responses, and that is divided into, hopefully what sounds familiar, the fight or flight and rest and digest. And the fight or flight is your sympathetic division. So sympathetic is fight or flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. Okay, so sympathetic, fight or flight, parasympathetic, rest and digest. And that's what we're going to be talking about, is these two guys and how they function to make everything work the way that it works. All right, so we just went through all of this. One thing we haven't talked about yet is enteric. Enteric refers to the GI system, and that gets separated because there are a lot of neurons in your digestive system that communicate without ever getting any input from the central nervous system. They do everything kind of on their own. They're like I say here, it's pretty independent, but it still is regulated by the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic is going to turn it down, and the parasympathetic, which is rest and digest, is going to increase the activity of your gastrointestinal tract and digestion and all that other stuff. I have another term here for nerves. So when we talk about neurons versus nerves, neurons are the actual cell. So you've got your cell body and you've got your axon and then your axon terminal. That's a neuron. So this is a cell, a nerve cell. Nerves are, you may have a bunch of cell bodies down here, cell body here, but their axons come together, and this bundle of axons here, that is a nerve. Okay? And then they may go wherever they're going to go. Okay? But the bundle of axons is a nerve. And usually, I will say also, where you have a bunch of cell bodies like this that are kind of lined up, that's a ganglion. Okay, so we're going to see that term too. It's also called, I think they call it a nucleus, maybe in the brain. But we're here talking about the ganglia, and a ganglia is just where all these cell bodies come from, and then the nerve is that group of axons, and then the projection is wherever it's going, the axon terminal. Okay, so a nerve is a bundle of axons and their sheaths, so we're talking about myelin there, if you remember myelin, that connects the central nervous system, sensory receptors, muscles, and glands So whatever, like you have your sciatic nerve. Your sciatic nerve kind of runs down the back and then down into your leg area. Okay, so that's a nerve that that a lot of us are familiar with. The splanchnic nerve. Splanchnic nerve is in your GI. There are a whole bunch of them. We have cranial nerves. We're going to talk about the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10, and but there are 12 of those, and then a bunch of spinal nerves that come out from your spinal cord in between your vertebrae. And we're going to see those too. All right, so receptors. We have to talk about receptors of the autonomic nervous system. Now, at least one of these, multiple of these, are going to sound familiar. So actually all of them should sound familiar to you by now. We're going to start with the acetylcholine receptors here because we're going to have acetylcholine, and then we're going to have the catecholamines. Well, really, we're going to have norepinephrine, epinephrine. Okay, epinephrine's hormone, but norepinephrine is involved in the sympathetic, and acetylcholine is involved in both, and we'll see how that takes place. And that's a very important point to remember when we're actually talking about the effect that it has. Though the muscarinic receptors are going to be involved in parasympathetic, and then you have your adrenal receptors, adrenergic receptors, that are involved in sympathetic. Okay, if that didn't make any sense, hopefully it will. So let's talk about the nicotinic receptor. Nicotinic receptor is ionotropic. And that just means that it opens an ion channel. Okay, so that's what we see here. And we see this when it's activated by acetylcholine, it opens an ion channel, and then sodium rushes in. Okay, it's also permeable to potassium, but that depolarization, that instant depolarization, is caused by sodium rushing in, and that's what starts our action potential. Okay. So there are two different types. I guess this is worth mentioning. There are those nicotinic acetylcholine receptors that we find on the muscle, and then there are those that we find in the autonomic nervous system as part of those connections. All right, and they're a little bit different. Drugs, they found drugs, hexa something. Still can't remember what that's called, but there's a drug that will bind differently to the nicotinic receptors on the muscle versus on the nerve. So we know that they're slightly different, but really they have the same function. So, and that is to act as an ion channel. So an ion channel for sodium and potassium, and they cause depolarization, that excitatory postsynaptic potential. So they cause so if you have a polarized cell at -70, they will cause that to possibly depolarize, reach that threshold, and cause an action potential. Okay. You can see from this picture here, it's made of 5 subunits: 2 alpha, gamma, beta, and it looks like a delta. And those are the 5 parts that come together to make that nice little channel. They're found at the motor end plate and skeletal muscle. So that's where we've heard of these. That's where we've talked about them. So that's a nicotinic in the muscle, so the NM. But they're also found on postganglionic dendrites of sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. Okay? And we have several pictures that are going to show that. All right, so that's where they are. They're on the muscle, and they're also on the sympathetic neurons. And since we're talking about autonomic nervous system, that's why we're bringing it up. So there are 5, okay, so muscarinic receptors. Let's see, someone had asked about these, and I thought that was a good point because I didn't really have a picture, but I found one. Anyway, so here's what we're talking about with the muscarinic receptor. 7-transmembrane protein. It's a G protein, okay? And you can see that it has a couple of different activities. One of them is to involves adenylyl cyclase and cyclic AMP, and the other is phospholipase C, and I believe the IP3, inositol triphosphate, I think. Anyway, but they have 2 different potential mechanisms, but either way, they're going to have whatever effect they have at the target. So there are 5 of these, and they don't all have different effects, but they are all different receptors. and they'll have either one of these two effects. All right, so G protein may affect adenylyl cyclase or phospholipase C activation. They're not ionic, okay? So we know that those are the nicotinic. So they may have a longer activation time than an ion channel, but they still can cause, depolarization, and they may just turn things on for a little while. So the nicotinic receptors, muscarinic receptors. Now, I'm putting this here, and I'll mention it again later, but the adrenal gland, we can't forget about the adrenal gland as being part of the autonomic nervous system. And the splanchnic nerve, I mentioned it a few minutes ago, is a nerve that kind of goes into the gut area, the viscera, and it innervates a bunch of stuff in there. And one of those things is the adrenal gland, where it releases acetylcholine onto nicotinic nerve and nicotinic receptors. Okay, so that happens in the adrenal medulla, and then the adrenal medulla, rather than releasing something to a neuron or from a neuron, it releases epinephrine into the blood. Okay, and we'll see that a couple of times. All right, so let's talk about these G protein coupled receptors. Yeah, there's our IP3. So this picture is from the Costanzo book. So there are alpha and beta. So we've been talking about alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2. And they are also, just like the muscarinic receptor, acetylcholine receptors, they are also the G protein coupled receptors, the 7-transmembrane protein. So this picture in your book kind of lays it out in a way that's not too bad, actually. I think this simplifies it in a way, because it can get really complicated, especially when you start moving down into the physiological actions. But in general, there are only a few ways that G proteins have their main effects, and this is going to talk about two of the main effects of G proteins. So we say that it activates a second messenger system. So the beauty or the interesting, I guess, thing about G protein receptors is that they span the membrane. Okay, they span the membrane, and a ligand combined on one side, on the external side, so it can bind here, but then the effect will involve several molecules downstream to have a magnified big effect. So you can take one receptor and you can have a very large effect inside the cell. Okay, so that's one of the things that's why the body uses these for so many functions. Because it has this pathway, and this pathway can kind of go in a lot of different directions. Okay, so let's look at these. So the alpha receptors, so that's norepinephrine, alpha 1, and so this is it, inactive, not doing anything. I'll kind of jump ahead, and I'll say when norepinephrine binds, we end up activating phospholipase C. So it does that because it's a G protein receptor. It's got these 3 subunits. The alpha, beta, and the gamma. So this alpha will bind GTP. That's why they're called G proteins, guanosine triphosphate, as opposed to adenosine triphosphate, ATP. So it's a GTP. So that's why they're G proteins. And that alpha subunit will then activate phospholipase C, and then phospholipase C, phosphatidylinositol diphosphate, I don't know, PIP2, and which will activate IP3, which is an inositol triphosphate. That's going to cause calcium to be released from the endoplasmic reticulum, or the SR. So if we're looking at this, it's a phospholipase C mechanism, and it increases calcium. Okay, and calcium then can have a lot of different effects. In this case, it's having an effect on the production of protein kinase C. Okay, which then can do a lot of things. Okay, and I know I'm being vague, but really, if you look at this, this is vague because we don't. Every mechanism has its own, specialty, but this is just putting the common parts of it. So for the GQ protein, G protein coupled receptor, this is how it works. We come over here, and we see the GS or G stimulatory protein, and it has a little bit different mechanism. So the norepinephrine binds to it, the alpha subunit binds that GTP, and then it activates adenylyl cyclase. Adenylyl cyclase turns ATP into this other signal molecule called cyclic AMP, and then that can have effects. Okay, so really we're talking about one type increases phospholipase C activity, the other one increases adenylyl cyclase activity. Okay, this one will lead to primarily an increase in calcium, and this one increases something called cyclic AMP. All right, so that's how they work. Those are your G proteins. So when we talk about G proteins, this is what we mean, and this is the effects that we'll see. We'll see things like, oh, it increases, you know, IP3, or it increases cyclic AMP, okay, as their effects, which we've already seen. All right, so let's get into more detail about the structure and how things are put together. So the autonomic nervous system divisions, okay, so we've got the sympathetic, which is the fight or flight, and the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest. Sympathetic division tends to be adrenergic at the effector organ or muscle. Okay, that's an important point to make because we're over here. Okay, so the effector organ. So if you're just trying to contract a muscle, your effector organ is the muscle. So that's skeletal muscle. That's the top one. Whoops. Okay, so that's the top one, is the is skeletal muscle. And then down here we have our sympathetic and our parasympathetic, and then we'll look a little bit later at the adrenal gland. But the sympathetic, the effector can be smooth muscle, okay? Because remember, this is all involuntary, so smooth muscle kind of makes sense on both of them, and glands on both of them. We have this kind of special category over here of sweat glands because it's kind of an outlier in how things work. But in general, that sympathetic division is going to release norepinephrine. Okay, the exception is acetylcholine onto sweat glands. Okay, we'll just say that, leave it there. But in general, our focus when it comes to sympathetic activation is norepinephrine. From the adrenal gland, it's epinephrine. All right. So on the effector organ, norepinephrine for sympathetic, and it's acetylcholine in the parasympathetic. Now, the norepinephrine binds to our adrenergic receptors, which we're going to take another look at those. The acetylcholine in the parasympathetic binds to muscarinic receptors. Now remember, on the skeletal muscle, it was nicotinic, okay, which is that ion channel. The muscarinic is that G protein. So that's how you can predict. So that's just the way it is. All right. So on the effector organ, it's acetylcholine on the muscarinic for parasympathetic. On the effector organ, meaning smooth muscle or glands, it's norepinephrine onto the alpha-1, alpha-2, beta-1, beta-2 adrenergic receptors. Okay. So we'll just kind of say that a few more times, and then we're going to have to come back and visit this area. And hopefully then it all just kind of makes sense. So norepinephrine or epinephrine, aka adrenaline, activate organs of the sympathetic division. The preganglionic, okay, so the postganglionic down, or the postganglionic releases norepinephrine onto the effector. And so if we come back here and we look, okay, well, there are two neurons involved, which there always are, okay, and this is the sympathetic chain, which we'll also look at. But you have this first neuron, and then you have a ganglion, which I said is like a collection of cell bodies, whatever, but there's a synapse there. Okay, so the preganglionic releases acetylcholine onto nicotinic, okay, receptors. Now the easy, I guess, test question, if that helps get your attention here, is that when we talk about sympathetic, our minds generally go to epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, like those are involved in the fight or flight. I mean, epinephrine, adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine. But we can't forget how that signal got there. And so if I say, what neurotransmitters are involved in activation of it, you're going to have to say both, because that first connection right here is acetylcholine binding to nicotinic receptors. Now, what makes that easy is that the parasympathetic also has two neurons, and it also has acetylcholine at that first synapse. Okay, the preganglionic synapsing with the postganglionic. So, I mean, it's that first connection is always going to be acetylcholine onto nicotinic, and that's also true at the adrenal medulla. Okay, so that's it. So the first connection, the preganglionic to postganglionic, is going to be acetylcholine onto nicotinic, no matter what. But then sympathetic, you're going to have norepinephrine released onto the effectors, and in the parasympathetic, you have acetylcholine onto muscarinic receptors. Okay. All right, hope that's starting to make sense. So autonomic versus somatic. So this is our autonomic pathway here. So the effect on smooth and cardiac muscle and glands, we're mainly talking about smooth muscle here. They are unconscious, so this is an unconscious kind of activation. We don't, intentionally activate cardiac muscle or smooth muscle. That's not something we consciously do. We can't consciously just cause our heart to beat and then stop beating. We can't do that. Same with our intestines. We can't. I mean, we can change our mood a little bit to, make our heart beat faster or slower, but that's about it. Target tissues may be stimulated or inhibited, so we don't just have activation or inhibition. We could have either one. Depends on that response of the G protein, because all of the effector muscles, all of these down here are G proteins. Okay, muscarinic are G proteins, and then these adrenergic receptors are G protein receptors. There are two synapses, the first one here being preganglionic to postganglionic, and the second one is postganglionic to the effector organ. Acetylcholine by preganglionic neurons, and that's going to be to nicotinic receptors. Nicotinic receptors. And then for the postganglionic are going to release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. And the receptor molecules, that varies with the synapse and the neurotransmitter. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense. Kind of went through it slowly enough. Maybe it will. All right, so axon neurotransmitters and receptor types. So this is all just kind of repeating the same thing. So I'm going to move through it a little more quickly. So note that the first axon, preganglionic, always releases acetylcholine to. So this is somatic. So that's just for comparison. So always releases acetylcholine to nicotinic receptors. That's what we see, no matter what, no matter where we are. This is true for sympathetic, parasympathetic, and the adrenal gland. The second neuron of the parasympathetic releases acetylcholine onto muscarinic receptors, and the adrenal medulla. Let's see, the sympathetic releases norepinephrine, so we can get that in there, but it releases norepinephrine here, and then the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine into the blood, which is what we see here. Okay. All right. So this is a table that I just kind of left in there for you to look at. It kind of organizes it. It's got the sympathetic here, parasympathetic there, and then it's got the somatic over here just for comparison. That's the skeletal muscle, remember. And then it talks about where the ganglia are located. So that first synapse, how long the axons are, short for sympathetic. The first one is the preganglionic, and then the postganglionic is long, and it's the opposite for parasympathetic. Yeah, right. So just kind of go through that. Names the receptors here. So that might be a good thing to look at to kind of keep you organized if it helps. All right, so let's look at some of the effects and some structures here. So we've got the parasympathetic over here in red. So this is the parasympathetic effects over here in red, and then the sympathetic over here in blue. The parasympathetic, you can see most of those neurons, the preganglionic neurons, originate top or bottom. So they're either going to come from the chain, the cranial nerves at the in the brainstem, or we're going to go all the way down here to the sacrum, and that's where they're going to originate. You don't see a lot, you don't see any parasympathetic neurons coming out of the spinal cord in between. Okay, that is reserved for sympathetic, which you see a lot of that over here. Okay, so now, you've got your preganglionic, your postganglionic. Remember, sympathetic, your preganglionic is longer, postganglionic is shorter. Over here, you see that your preganglionic is actually, what's going on is that neuron that comes out of the central nervous system here is synapsing in this group, this chain of ganglia or cell bodies. So the cell bodies tend to originate from these areas, and that's where your first synapse is, and that's the case up here. Okay, these are just kind of moving through, and they extend down into. So the cell bodies are collected here, but they synapse maybe down here into these ganglia for these organs, which includes the digestive system and the bladder. Okay, because dotted line is the second, the postganglionic. So you see these little ganglia here, as well as up here. All right, but the neuron itself is kind of moving down here and then away. But in general, the first ganglia, the preganglionic, is shorter. All right, so sympathetic nervous system has a sympathetic chain that communicates with other sympathetic neurons. Sympathetic nervous system activates the adrenal gland down here, which releases epinephrine into the blood. In control over digestion, has its own special ganglia. It's longer. It has a longer preganglionic chain, which is what I just mentioned here. Okay, in that area. All right, so that's kind of how that's structured. And then I have the book, Costanzo book has their own, which also kind of maybe gives more information here. But the sympathetic axon reach organs through that ganglionic chain, or that ganglion chain, and this is kind of showing the same thing that we saw on the other slide. So spinal nerves, those are coming out of the spinal cord, which is what we see here, T1, L3, thoracic 1, lumbar. Head and neck nerve plexuses. Plexuses are just kind of divisions where you have some neurons kind of coming together and branching. So we can see a plexus kind of here, 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 and that's that branching and convergence of neurons. So head, neck, thoracic nerve plexuses, and abdominal pelvic nerve plexuses. So parasympathetic, we see these cranial nerves. So cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and then 10. 10's the big one. Now they're all important, of course, because they have effects on your muscle of your eye, and eyes dilating or constricting, lacrimal nasal glands, parotid glands, so salivary glands, those kinds of things. But then we get down to 10, cranial nerve 10, and it has so many functions. The heart, this is parasympathetic, so it's going to slow the heart down. It's going to kind of close off a little bit the bronchi and some of the blood vessels going to it. So if you're not, we don't want to have that open if we don't have to. It's kind of a protective mechanism to reduce, I guess, dust and germs. The stomach, the intestines, the organs of the intestines, the parasympathetic is going to turn that up, and that all kind of originates through this vagus nerve, this cranial nerve 10. And then down here in the sacrum, remember there's really nothing going on in the most of the spinal cord on down. But down here in the sacrum, we have parasympathetic innervation of the bladder and for defecation, and then parasympathetic is also for like an erection in the male genitalia. I think we're going to come back and talk about that when we talk about reproduction. So so we are going to talk more about the bladder control today. And if I kind of go back, we can see sympathetic. Let's see. I think sympathetic. Does it mention the bladder here? No, it does on the other one. Orgasm is sympathetic control, by the way. Okay, in male genitalia. All right. Okay. So again, this picture, I clearly like that picture. I think it's very picturesque. But this, I've kind of paired it with the activity of what's going on in sympathetic versus parasympathetic. So this is another thing that's kind of interesting to look at. It shows the action. So the heart, the SA node, and your heart rate is going to increase. That the beta 1 adrenergic receptor is responsible for that. That's your sympathetic response. Your parasympathetic, it's going to reduce the heart rate, and a muscarinic receptor is responsible for that. That's what's going to be found on that SA node and the AB node, because it kind of has the same effect on both. It has to, and we'll see why when we talk about the heart. And then we can just kind of go through here, and I've done that in some of these other slides. I've kind of we're going to talk specifically about some of the effects, and then I pointed some out in the next slide after this. So let's talk about these receptors, because you're going to have to know what so these first are the adrenergic receptors, and then the cholinergic receptors. So you're going to have to kind of know. I guess the hard part is the adrenergic receptors. You need to know in general where these are. Okay. So I'm trying to make it easy for you and obvious, but the alpha 1 is found on vascular. So when we say vascular smooth muscle, we're talking about blood vessels. Now there's overlap. I don't mean to say this is all just exclusive, but primarily when it comes to what you need to remember to function out in the world, these are really important. GI tract, the bladder. So we're going to go over that again, the alpha 1 on the bladder. And then their mechanism of action over here is that increased calcium. So activation. Okay. All right, alpha 2. So GI tract wall. So we're not going to really get into the alpha 2 now, but that really is going to. It's kind of inhibitory. It decreases norepinephrine release wherever it has an effect. But yeah, so it kind of has a inhibitory effect. And then the beta 1, so its effect on the heart. Okay, so whereas blood vessels was associated with alpha 1, the heart is associated with beta 1, and then there's some other functions here. Beta 2, that's so vascular smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, which I guess includes the diaphragm, but really the bronchioles is what we tend to think about with beta 2. Now we're going to talk about micturition or urinating, and so this bladder wall will also come into play. So the bladder up here for alpha 1, and of course vascular. All right, cholinergic, that's a little bit easier. Nicotinic is on skeletal muscle, and it's on those the receptor is on the postganglionic neuron, the dendrite there, because the preganglionic releases acetylcholine onto that postganglionic. And then if it's the muscarinic is going to be found at the effector of parasympathetic. Okay? So that's what I've been saying, and that's where the organ is. That's going to be your rest and digest. areas. Okay. So all effector organs and also sweat glands in the sympathetic. So, but we're trying not to let that trip us up too much. Okay. All right. So this is what I was talking about with kind of getting into some of the specifics on how on the effects that these have. And so I've already mentioned the vagus nerve. It releases acetylcholine to muscarinic receptors on the heart and the in the GI system. That is your parasympathetic control. Parasympathetic. It's going to decrease blood pressure. It's going to increase digestion. Okay. The SA node. That's the heart's pacemaker, along with the AV node is also kind of included in there, but the main pacemaker is the SA node. So when acetylcholine is released onto that SA node, the heart slows down, which is going to lower blood pressure. Okay, so that's our parasympathetic. The sympathetic, the activation of beta-1 receptors. So if you have a sympathetic response, it activates the beta-1 receptors. That's going to cause an increase in heart rate and the force of contraction, and that's going to increase blood pressure. Okay, so these are kind of working against each other in a way, but also together to keep your blood pressure consistent and functional. So sympathetic activation generally causes increased blood pressure overall. Okay, so if you release, what that means is that if you have a release of epinephrine, if you are injected with epinephrine, let's say you have your EpiPen and you have an allergic type of response, when you inject that, your heart is going to beat faster, harder, and your blood pressure is going to increase. Okay, so that's an overall type of effect. Even though in certain areas you're going to have vasodilation and that kind of thing, when it comes right down to it, when the sum of all of that comes together, it's going to increase blood pressure. And we kind of know that because epinephrine is our adrenaline, and an adrenaline rush, faster heartbeat, higher blood pressure. Okay, so I have here some questions. Let's see, in the heart, if we see that the sympathetic is the beta-1 receptor primarily in the heart. What happens if you give a beta blocker? If you block the beta adrenergic receptors, they can be selective for beta-1 or they can be non-selective and also hit beta-2. But if you block beta receptors, then that's going to keep your blood pressure from going up. Okay, so it's going to control blood pressure. So it's going to, we could say it lowers blood pressure. Okay, a muscarinic blocker like atropine is going to do the opposite. It's going to make your heart beat faster because it's saying, so the vagus nerve is releasing that acetylcholine, atropine gets in there and blocks that muscarinic receptor and says, no acetylcholine, you can't slow down the heart. We're going to keep it going fast right now, okay? So if somebody's heart rate is slow and their blood pressure is dropping, you can give atropine and that'll kind of help. Or, well, it better help because that's what it's supposed to do. All right, and then bladder emptying is parasympathetic. Let's see, I have that written there correctly, right? Bladder contraction and emptying, yes, you pee, rest and digest. Is parasympathetic. Bladder relaxation and filling, to relax that muscle, is sympathetic. Okay, so we've already kind of talked about it, but I have slides dedicated to this, so because it's stuff you need to know. Heart control. So we have a picture here, and we can kind of see what's going on. So the SA node is the primary pacemaker of the heart. Now, I will say that the AV node is down here, and when I use words like primary pacemaker, that means there's a secondary pacemaker. So if the first pacemaker fails, so the pacemaker, what it's doing is it's keeping your heart beating on a regular basis, okay, so at whatever, 75, 80 beats a minute, 70 to 80 beats a minute is normal. Could be higher, could be lower. So that's the SA node's pace. The AV node might be a little slower. So if the SA node doesn't fire, the AV node will jump in and fire for it. Okay? So I want to say that so you know that these guys, this is kind of the backup. Like okay, SA node, you didn't go, so I'm going to go. So if we're going to slow the pace, so that's what the parasympathetic neuron or parasympathetic activation will do, is it releases acetylcholine onto that muscarinic receptor. If we're going to slow the pace of the SA node, well, we better tell the AV node so it doesn't jump in and take over. Okay? So we're slowing both of them. That's why it goes to both. So even though we're talking about the SA node as a primary pacemaker, we also have to, you know, kind of tell the backup quarterback here to kind of chill. All right. So the parasympathetic activation from the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10, slows the heart. Sympathetic over here, it's got that ganglion chain, and that signal goes through there, comes from the medulla. We're going to get why the medulla is part of the control of the autonomic nervous system, that and the hypothalamus. But it comes from there, and then it sends that signal also to the SA node and the AV node, but the sympathetic signal is going to say beat faster. It's going to say that to these nodes. We also see a branch going down and kind of going over the entire heart where it's releasing norepinephrine, or if it's from the blood, epinephrine, and it's telling the heart to beat harder, to make those contractions stronger. Okay, so now we have, with the sympathetic activation, we have the heart beating faster and increasing contractility or contractile force, which is going to make it beat, squeeze more blood, which is going to increase blood pressure even more. All right, so let's talk about bladder control. We have a few slides on that because it's kind of interesting, especially if you think about spinal cord damage. Like if I have spinal cord damage to the sacral area, you know, jumped out of a plane without a parachute, landed on my butt, whatever, then that's going to have an effect versus spinal cord damage in the lumbar. And that's one of the important points of learning how this all works. Okay, so parasympathetic, note that the parasympathetic nervous system originates at that brain stem and the bottom of the spine down here. So this is our parasympathetic. Okay, it's the one that doesn't have the chain, so it's not in the middle, it's just at the top and the bottom. And down at the bottom in the sacrum, you have control over, really it's over like defecation and urination. Okay, so we're going to talk about urination. So these sacral nerves control the bladder, and because it is parasympathetic, it's going to cause you to urinate. The sympathetic over here also synapses down here at the mesenteric ganglion. So we have that synapse, and then it is going to cause you to store urine. Okay, so it's going to say no urinate. Let's collect that urine in this bladder bag we have, and the parasympathetic is going to say no. Actually, let's get rid of it. Now is a good time. All right. So more details. Sympathetic control predominates during filling of the bladder. So we have two of those adrenergic receptors, the alpha-1, it's present on the internal sphincter, and that's going to prevent flow out of the bladder. So we're saying squeeze that, hold it in. This is important because there's a drug called tamsulosin that blocks this and says, no, you can go ahead and let it out. And that's for people who aren't able to void. Okay, usually from BPH, benign prostatic hyperplasia. Okay, so that's the alpha-1, and that's your external or your internal sphincter. It's the sphincter that's letting urine out. The external sphincter, you just control that. You can squeeze that or release it, however, as much as you want to. That's the one you can control. The beta-2 receptors are on that detrusor muscle, and those, when they're activated, keep it relaxed so the bladder can fill. Okay, so we don't want it to squeeze and not fill. We want it to relax and let it fill. So when sympathetic innervation is under control, that's when it's filling. So that doesn't mean that you're not calm when your bladder is full. This is just using these two autonomic systems. Okay, so this is just reflexes that happen on a day-to-day basis. It's not dependent on having an adrenaline rush or anything like that. This is just their function. Parasympathetic is responsible for the micturition reflex, which is the fancy word for peeing, basically, bladder emptying. So muscarinic acetylcholine receptors cause that internal sphincter to relax. Let's see. And the detrusor muscle to contract, which squeezes urine out through the urethra. I hope I told you this right. Let's see. Well, we'll come back to it. I mean, I know I'm telling you this how it works, right? I'm hoping I didn't mess up my tamsulosin function with the drug here. Okay, so the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors cause the internal sphincter to relax and for the detrusor muscle to contract. So that's your muscarinic receptor. Says the sphincter can relax, the detrusor muscle contracts, and then you're able to squeeze the urine out. That is your parasympathetic response. So relaxing and contracting the external sphincter is usually a voluntary process in adults. A lot of times so it's all controlled in the pons. Let's see, the pontine micturition center of the brain, which is in the pons, which is your brain stem. That's how we kind of control that. So we can release that external sphincter, open that up, and then a lot of times that can, I guess, trigger the pontine micturition center, and then you can turn on the parasympathetic reflex and cause urination to happen. Okay. All right, so a few more details about how this works. Mechanoreceptors on the bladder wall, those are what sense the stretching. Okay, so that can send a signal to us saying, hey, the bladder is full. In a baby, it's only when you have enough stretching. So a baby doesn't just pee all the time. When those mechanoreceptors are activated, indicating that the bladder is full, that's when they send the signal, and that's when you'll turn on that parasympathetic reflex. So the bladder will fill to a certain point. Mechanoreceptors say, hey, it's full, and then parasympathetic activation happens, and it empties, and then there's no more receptor information coming in, so the sympathetic pathway is activated, and we have filling. The sphincter goes closed and relaxation, and it just keeps happening. The only difference is that in adults, we're able to override that and say, okay, now we're peeing, and now is not a good time. Okay, that's an important function to have. Okay, so I was right with the tamsulosin because it's written here. So that blocks the alpha-1 receptor, and remember that alpha-1 receptor is what's squeezing that internal sphincter. Okay, and so if you block function of that alpha-1 receptor, then you don't have, or you have a reduced ability to squeeze it. So when the parasympathetic wants to take over, there's no competition. It just says, okay, sphincter, you're gonna open, and you're gonna open as much as you can open. And also, there's musculature on the prostate. I don't know why the ureter or the urethra runs through the prostate, but it does, and so that's what's blocking it a lot of times. So it will also sort of reduce that smooth muscle activation there, and it lets urine out. It's really nice. How does tamsulosin affect the autonomic nervous system? Well, it's blocking the alpha receptor, so it's blocking part of the sympathetic. All right, pupil dilation, that's another thing that we're kind of talking about. So reciprocal control by the pupillary dilator muscle and the pupillary constrictor muscle. Essentially, what we're going to remember here is that sympathetic activation is going to cause pupil dilation. Okay, so the pupillary dilator muscle is controlled by alpha-1 receptors, which when we see alpha-1, we know that's adrenergic, we know that's sympathetic. Okay. All right. And so activation causes contraction of the dilator muscle, and you have dilation. I know it sounds weird saying it contracts and so it dilates, but that's what happens. The pupillary constrictor muscle, or the pupillary constrictor muscle, I'm not sure why pupillary is highlighted and not constrictor, or all of it, but it's controlled by muscarinic receptors, which is parasympathetic. Okay? Activation causes constriction of the sphincter, which causes pupil constriction. So meiosis, but not MEI like cell division, but pupil constriction. And mydriasis is dilation, pupil dilation. Okay, I get those terms mixed up a lot. Okay, so I probably won't expect you to keep them straight, just FYI. The mydriasis and the meiosis. All right, so adrenal gland. So let's talk about that because we've been kind of throwing that term out. So let's kind of sit on it for a minute. So the adrenal gland sits, speaking of sitting on things, sits on the kidney like the kidney's hat. Okay, so it's adrenal, renal refers to the kidney. It has two parts. There's the cortex and the medulla. The cortex, like with most things, the cortex is the outer part and the medulla is the inner part. Some people pronounce it medulla. I didn't learn it that way, but either one works. So it has two parts, the cortex and the medulla. The medulla is the older part evolutionarily of the adrenal gland. It's responsible for the release of adrenaline. We'll see why that matters, because when we think about things like, and this actually helps me remember it, to tell you the truth. When I think the medulla is the older part, it's like, you know, it's kind of grunt, adrenaline, you know, that's how we're going to get things done. The cortex is going to release some other things that are, we're gonna talk about those. I don't want to get into it too much now, but a little more refined. The cortex is a little more refined, but that medulla is like epinephrine, adrenaline, let's go. So preganglionic neurons, remember everything, that first neuron, the preganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine, and they're going to release it onto nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. That's true for sympathetic, parasympathetic, and the adrenal gland. Chromaffin cells are what they're called. So the adrenal medulla will release epinephrine. About 80% of it is epinephrine, and then about 20% of it is norepinephrine. Usually when we talk about function of the medulla, we talk about it releasing epinephrine, okay? Because it is mostly epinephrine. But if we're being truthful about it, there is some norepinephrine that's also released. And that's because it's got the enzymes. You have to make norepinephrine to make epinephrine, so there's some kind of lingering behind. Probably has to do with kinetics and how quickly they're made, you know, that kind of thing. But either way, yeah, it's both, but mostly epinephrine. So epinephrine released from the adrenal medulla will travel through the blood to the entire body and have an effect wherever there are receptors. So earlier we saw on the heart, we saw that there was activation on the heart. So, well, if we have epinephrine released onto cardiac tissue, it will cause an increase in contractile force. So it'll cause the heart to beat harder. Okay? But, you know, it's epinephrine and it's the blood, so it's going to go everywhere. That's why we call it, when the medulla releases that epinephrine, it's everywhere, and we feel it everywhere. If you're in the car and somebody, you know, moves a little bit and kind of scares you, your leg starts to shake, your heart's beating, that's your adrenal medulla, I don't know, trying to get you to run away or something, whatever your fight or flight response is. Or if you remember that, you know, you forgot to bring your homework with you, yeah, that's evolution, yeah. Let's have a full-on meltdown because of that. Okay, so coordination of function within the system. So this is kind of the I guess the push and pull of the parasympathetic for the sympathetic. So these are just, you know, some examples. Contraction of the detrusor muscles associated with relaxation of the internal sphincter. That's the parasympathetic response, and we've already been through this. That's why I'm going faster. The sympathetic is relaxation of the detrusors associated with constriction of the internal sphincter. So back and forth. So we've got parasympathetic and sympathetic, and they're kind of working together. Same with the GI system. So pushing things through the intestines. So the contraction of that smooth muscle is definitely a rest and digest parasympathetic thing. Opening the sphincters to let the digested stuff move through, parasympathetic. The opposite happens with sympathetic. That smooth muscle doesn't move, and the sphincter muscles close. Okay? So that's what that means. All right. So other innervation that does not involve that push and pull, that reciprocation, tends to mostly be sympathetic. I think, let's see, there's an example over here. But it tends to be sympathetic that will not have a parasympathetic partner, I guess. So the examples that we have here are vascular smooth muscle. So if we look over here, vascular smooth muscle, we see sympathetic activity and we don't see anything for parasympathetic. Okay? So that means that for these activities to cause them to happen, we activate the sympathetic nervous system. And so for, let's see, skeletal muscle here, we'll say alpha 1, we were talking about that, causes constriction. So if we activate that and it causes constriction and vasoconstriction, there is no parasympathetic saying, okay, let's dilate it now. It is just, okay, we're going to have less sympathetic activation, and that's dilation. And then the beta 2, of course, in the bronchial and some of the skeletal muscle, that's the opposite. Okay, pilomotor muscle of the skin. If we want our skin to kind of stick up, or hair to kind of stick up, it's sympathetic activation. And then if we want it to not stick up anymore, we just stop the sympathetic activation. So it kind of goes down the line. Sweat glands, the liver, gluconeogenesis, yeah, sympathetic activation. Let's make more glucose. Let's get rid of let's break down the fat so we can use that as energy. And then renin is a way to kind of increase blood pressure with aldosterone. And anyway, all of these things have their effect. And then when we don't want them to happen, we just remove that sympathetic signal. Okay, so I have this note here. Control of this is sometimes referred to as sympathetic tone. That means there's almost always some level of activation ranging from minimal to full activation. And this is important because a drug that blocks will have what seems like an opposite effect, even though it's just reducing the sympathetic signal. So prazosin is a drug that causes a decrease in blood pressure. It does that by blocking alpha-1 receptors. Okay, so we're removing the sympathetic signal, which is causing vasodilation, which is lowering blood pressure. The parasympathetic nervous system never got involved in that. So we're lowering blood pressure, and we don't even need the parasympathetic. We don't even need its permission. However, it does have its own ways through the heart to lower blood pressure, which is important for something called autonomic dysreflexia, which we'll talk about another day. Okay, so the hypothalamus and the brainstem, I kind of alluded to that a little while ago. The hypothalamus is in charge of autonomic control, and so are certain areas of the pons and the medulla. We consider that kind of the lizard brain. That's like the part that's not very developed and pretty much works the same in every species. So so we can kind of go through that and look at how that works. So the hypothalamus, we see the hypothalamus up here in this area, and then the pons and the medulla here, and we can see all of these places where we control temperature, thirst, urination in that the micturition center, pneumotaxic, and then we have down here the respiratory center. Those work together. Cardiovascular, swallowing, coughing, vomiting centers. So all of these things are sort of part of this homeostasis, this autonomic control back and forth. So let's read through some of these examples. We've already kind of talked about them. So baroreceptors monitor pressure in the carotid sinus, and then that will signal to this cardiovascular motor center, vasomotor center, and that's going to result in blood pressure changes. Let's say if it says your blood pressure is low, it's going to cause activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and your blood pressure is going to increase. If it's high, then that'll tell the parasympathetic, and that's going to cause your heart to beat slower, okay, and decrease. So we're trying to keep it correct. Carbon dioxide and oxygen in the blood, so these are chemoreceptors for ventilation rate and depth control from that pneumotaxic center and the respiratory center. Those work together to increase or decrease the rate and the depth of ventilation or breathing. Mechanoreceptors from the bladder, not going to get into a lot of detail on that because we just talked about it, but those mechanoreceptors from the bladder to the micturition center of the brain, pontine micturition center. And then also thermoreceptors for temperature, so we have temperature regulation in the hypothalamus, but all of those things are ultimately helping to control the autonomic nervous system, and that is our last slide. Have a good day or night.